When World War II is discussed, most stories focus on male soldiers, generals, and massive battles. But thousands of women also wore uniforms, carried weapons, served as medics, couriers, pilots, and resistance fighters. And when they were captured by German forces, their fate was often far worse than anything written in official reports. Female soldiers were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as exceptions, and exceptions were dangerous. Many German officers believed that armed women violated the natural order. In their eyes, a woman who fought was not a legitimate soldier. She was something to be punished. Captured women were often denied POW status, stripped of rank and identity, interrogated far more aggressively than men. Some were labeled partisans instead of soldiers, a single word that removed all legal protection. For these women, capture did not mean imprisonment. It meant uncertainty, humiliation, and fear of what would happen next. Survivors later said the most terrifying moment was not torture or hunger. It was the silence, when guards stopped calling them prisoners and started calling them examples. And this was only the beginning. For captured female soldiers, interrogation was never just about information. It was about breaking identity. German interrogators often began calmly. Names, units, dates, routes, but the tone shifted quickly. Female prisoners were told they had no legal status. "No army sends women to fight," some officers said. "You chose this. Now accept the consequences." Unlike male POWs, women were frequently interrogated repeatedly without records, isolated from other prisoners, denied sleep for days. Interrogations stretched for hours, sometimes days, not to extract facts, but to wear them down. Survivors later recalled something chilling. They already knew the answers. They just wanted to see how long we would resist. German officers feared armed women in a way they never admitted. A woman who fought shattered propaganda. She proved that belief could be stronger than fear, and belief was dangerous. That is why interrogations became less about questions and more about making an example. Some women were forced to witness punishments given to others. Not violence, but humiliation, carefully staged to send a message. "You are not soldiers," they were told. "You are warnings." By the end of interrogation, many prisoners understood the truth. Capture did not mean survival. It meant being tested, to see who would break first. And soon, the testing moved beyond words. For male prisoners of war, camps followed rules, at least on paper. For women, those rules often did not apply. After interrogation, captured female soldiers were rarely sent to standard POW camps. Instead, many were transferred to separate sections, labor camps, or facilities officially labeled as temporary holding. That word, temporary, meant something terrifying. In these camps, women were treated as political threats rather than soldiers, moral warnings rather than prisoners, expendable labor rather than humans. Uniforms were taken away. Names were replaced with numbers, if numbers were given at all. Guards enforced discipline not through open violence but through control, endless roll calls, arbitrary punishments, constant relocation. Survivors later said this was deliberate. Stability gave prisoners hope, so stability was denied. Female soldiers were often assigned the hardest labor, clearing rubble, carrying supplies, working in freezing conditions with little food. And yet, something unexpected happened. Despite exhaustion and fear, many women refused to disappear. They shared scraps of food. They whispered songs at night. They memorized each other's names, even when the system tried to erase them. German authorities noticed. A group that should have broken was still holding together, and that made them dangerous. Because resistance does not always look like escape or rebellion. Sometimes resistance is simply surviving when you were meant to vanish. That is when the system changed again, and conditions became even harsher. At first, the guards barely noticed. Women sharing food, helping the weak stand during roll call, whispering names so no one would be forgotten. But the system was built on isolation, not unity. When German camp authorities realized that female prisoners were forming bonds, everything changed. Groups were suddenly split apart. Close friends were reassigned to different barracks overnight. Anyone seen comforting another prisoner was marked. The message was clear: survive alone or don't survive at all. Punishments were no longer random. They were targeted. Entire groups were forced to stand for hours because one woman whispered. Work rations were cut because someone shared bread. Sleep was interrupted again and again. Not for discipline, but for exhaustion. Guards understood something important. Fear breaks individuals, but solidarity threatens systems. Some officers openly stated that women were too emotional to resist long-term pressure. They were wrong. Instead of open rebellion, resistance became quieter. Coded looks, memorized routines, silent agreements to never leave someone behind. Women took turns collapsing so others could rest. They hid weakness until nightfall. They learned to suffer strategically, and this terrified the guards, because it meant punishment was no longer working. When fear fails, systems escalate. Soon, the camps introduced new measures, not to control behavior, but to destroy hope itself. By late stages of captivity, German camp authorities reached a troubling conclusion. Fear was failing. Despite hunger, exhaustion, and separation, many female prisoners were still standing, not hopeful, but unbroken. So the system changed again. This time, punishment was no longer about pain or discipline, it was about erasing the future. Women were given meaningless labor, tasks designed to lead nowhere, digging holes that would be filled the next day, sorting materials that would never be used. Hope depends on purpose, so purpose was removed. Guards began spreading rumors deliberately. The war will never end. No one is coming for you. You've already been forgotten. Letters were withheld. Names were never spoken. Time itself became a weapon. Some women later said this phase was the hardest. Hunger weakens the body. Fear exhausts the mind. But hopelessness attacks something deeper. And yet, something unexpected happened again. Women began creating small futures. They planned meals they would cook after the war. They described places they would return to. They promised to tell each other stories, if only one survived. German officers did not understand this. They believed resistance required weapons or escape plans. They did not realize that memory itself had become defiance. As long as these women remembered who they were, the system had failed. That realization led to one final shift, a decision that would determine who lived and who would not. As the war began to turn against Germany, the camps changed again, not for the better. Bombs could be heard in the distance. Supply lines weakened. Orders became confused, rewritten, or contradicted overnight, and with uncertainty came panic. German authorities feared one thing above all else: witnesses. Female prisoners, especially those who had survived interrogation, labor camps, and years of captivity, were living proof of crimes that were never meant to be recorded. So policies shifted quietly. Transfers increased. Prisoners were moved without explanation, often at night. Records disappeared or were deliberately destroyed. Some women were told they were being relocated for safety. Others were given no explanation at all. Guards became harsher, not because they were confident, but because they were afraid. Survivors later remembered this period as the most unpredictable. One day, a guard would look away and allow food to be shared. The next, the same guard would punish an entire barracks without warning. As Allied forces approached, camps were evacuated hastily. Prisoners were forced onto marches with little food, weak shoes, and no destination clearly stated. These were not organized movements. They were attempts to erase people before liberation arrived. And yet, even here, female soldiers made impossible choices. Some helped others walk, knowing it might kill them both. Some stayed behind with the sick, fully aware of the risk. Some memorized faces, names, and places. determined that if they survived, the truth would survive with them. Because by now, they understood something clearly. Survival was no longer just personal. It was evidence. And the closer freedom came, the more dangerous it became to stay alive. When the camps were finally reached by Allied forces, many believed the nightmare was over. For some, it was. For others, it was only changing form. Female soldiers who survived captivity were liberated exhausted, ill, and barely recognizable. Not only physically, but socially. They were not welcomed as heroes. In many cases, they were met with silence. Military officials questioned them aggressively. Civilians avoided them. Some were treated with suspicion rather than sympathy. There was an unspoken belief: if you survived, something must be wrong. Many women were never officially recognized as prisoners of war. Their records were incomplete or destroyed. Their suffering existed only in memory. Some were ordered not to speak about what happened. Others spoke and were ignored. Even within their own countries, female veterans faced doubts. Why were you there? Why didn't you die? Why didn't you resist more? The same strength that helped them survive captivity now isolated them in peace. Nightmares followed them home. So did guilt for those who didn't survive. And yet, some refused to let the story end in silence. They wrote names. They gave testimony. They stood in courtrooms decades later and spoke calmly about things no one wanted to hear, because they understood something the world had not yet accepted. Survival does not mean safety. Liberation does not mean justice. And remembering is sometimes the hardest battle of all. For decades, their stories stayed buried. Not because there were no survivors, but because the world was not ready to listen. Female soldiers who endured captivity rarely spoke loudly. They did not build monuments for themselves. They did not demand attention. Many simply returned to ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary memories. Some became teachers, some nurses, some mothers and grandmothers, and some never spoke again. But slowly, history began to change. Archives were opened. Testimonies were recorded. Names once erased were written back into record. Historians finally acknowledged a truth long ignored. These women were not victims because they were weak. They were targeted because they were strong. They challenged an ideology that believed power belonged only to men, to fear, to control. Their survival exposed a system that tried to erase them quietly, and it failed. Not all survived. Not all were recognized, but none were forgotten forever. Because every time their stories are told, every time their names are spoken, every time silence is broken, they win again. History is not just written by the victors. It is remembered by those who refuse to disappear, and these women never did.